He could have shot down his enemy. Instead, he saved him. On December 20th, 1943, the sky over Germany was as cold as the war itself. High above the ground, among gray clouds, smoke from anti-aircraft bursts, and icy wind, an American B-17 bomber struggled through the air. Its name was Ye Olde Pub. Earlier that morning, it had been part of a large formation, one of the many flying fortresses sent to break through to the target, drop their bombs, and return through fire, fighters, and death. But now it was flying alone, not like a fortress, but like a wounded animal that somehow still remained in the sky. The aircraft's body was riddled with holes, the nose was smashed, the tail was damaged. One engine was dead, another was running badly. The metal trembled, air screamed through the openings, and the instruments showed things the pilot did not want to see. Inside it was cold, loud, and terrifying. Some of the crew were wounded. One man was dead. Several machine guns could no longer defend the aircraft. The bomber had fallen behind the formation, lost its protection, and was alone over enemy territory. For a heavy bomber, that almost always meant one thing: the end. At the controls sat a young American pilot named Charlie Brown. He was only 21 years old. This was his first combat mission as an aircraft commander, and it had already turned into a nightmare. He could not allow himself to panic. He could not allow himself to think that the plane should not have survived. In the commander's seat, thoughts like that are useless. If the aircraft is still flying, then it must be flown. If the men are still alive, then they must be brought home. War does not leave a man many choices, especially when there are wounded crewmen behind him, enemy land beneath him, and ahead of him an icy sea and the long road home. And then a German fighter appeared beside them. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 came so close to the damaged B-17 that the Americans could see the pilot. To them, it meant almost certain death. A lone bomber over Germany was easy prey. It was damaged, separated from its formation, barely able to defend itself, and flying low and heavy, as if every mile demanded more strength than it had left. All the German pilot had to do was pull the trigger. A few bursts of fire, and the huge machine would fall from the sky. It would have been an ordinary episode of war, another aircraft destroyed, another line in a report, another set of names on a casualty list. But no shots came. The German pilot flew beside them. He looked at the shattered aircraft, at the holes in its fuselage, at the silent guns, at the marks of battle, at the men inside that crippled machine. He saw not merely a target. He saw an aircraft that was already almost destroyed. He saw a crew that was no longer an equal opponent in combat. He saw the dead tail gunner. He saw the wounded. And in that moment he did what no one in the American bomber could have expected. He did not fire. The German pilot's name was Franz Stigler. To understand how extraordinary his decision was, one must imagine what the skies over Germany were like at the end of 1943. This was not a place of romantic duels, where two pilots met in a clean and honorable fight. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. American bombers flew by day against German cities, factories, ports, rail hubs, and aircraft plants. They flew in tight formations because that was the only way they could survive. A single B-17 was powerful, but a formation of B-17s became a wall of fire. Machine guns covered overlapping sectors, aircraft protected one another, and enemy fighters had a harder time approaching without being hit. But the moment one bomber fell behind, everything changed. The formation moved on. The sky became empty. a machine that only minutes earlier had been part of a great force, suddenly became a slow, heavy, isolated target. German fighters hunted exactly such aircraft. A damaged, separated B-17 was too valuable to ignore. It carried a crew, weapons, equipment, and most importantly, it was part of the air war that was destroying German industry. For a Luftwaffe pilot, shooting one down was not merely a personal success. It was a military duty. That day, Charlie Brown's crew had flown to bomb Bremen. The target was dangerous. Bremen was defended by anti-aircraft guns and fighters, and the route to it passed through airspace, where every minute could be the last. As the bombers approached the target, anti-aircraft shells began exploding around them. Black flak clouds appeared suddenly in the sky like dirty flowers of death. They did not have to hit the aircraft directly. They only had to burst nearby. Shrapnel tore through skin, severed cables, damaged engines, shattered glass, and maimed men. Inside a bomber, it did not feel like a beautiful battle. It felt like chaos. Impact, cracking metal, voices shouting over the intercom, the smell of hot oil, powder, and blood. Ye Olde Pub suffered terrible damage. Fighters attacked it. Flak tore into it. It lost the formation. For a time, the aircraft effectively went out of control and began to fall. For the crew, that could have been the end right there. But Brown managed to regain control. He pulled the aircraft back as best he could and turned toward home. Not because he was sure he could make it, but because there was no other choice. War often reveals courage not as a grand gesture, but as the stubborn continuation of action, when everything is already against you. Brown did not make speeches. He did not see himself as a hero. He simply held the controls while the aircraft still responded. He had to think, not about legend, not about the future story, not about how it would sound decades later. He had to think about altitude, heading, engines, wounded men, fuel, and how to reach England. A man in such a moment does not live in the future. He lives in the next second. Franz Stigler saw the damaged B-17 from the ground. He was an experienced German pilot, a man who already knew war not from stories but from life. For him, it was an opportunity. In front of him was an enemy bomber, almost defenseless and separated from its group. Stigler took off, caught up with it, and reached a position from which he could easily destroy it. He saw the huge machine ahead of him. He saw that it did not move like a healthy aircraft. He saw that it was battered, and the closer he came, the less that aircraft looked like a military target, and the more it looked like a flying grave that, by some mistake, had not yet fallen. In such moments, war demands simplicity. An enemy is an enemy. A target is a target. If you can shoot, you shoot. The system does not like complicated human questions. It is designed to remove hesitation. A fighter pilot must shoot down enemy aircraft. A bomber must bomb. An anti-aircraft gunner must fire. A soldier must obey orders. But the human being inside that system still remains human, and sometimes he sees too much to continue acting mechanically. Stigler came closer and saw what he could not unsee. The tail gunner was dead. The guns were silent. The fuselage was torn open with holes. Inside he could see wounded men. This no longer looked like a fair fight. It looked like an execution. Later, this scene would often be explained through a pilot's code, through the words of his mentor, through the idea of military honor. But at its core, it was simpler and more frightening. Stigler looked at the enemy and saw human beings. For Charlie Brown and his crew, it looked very different. They did not know what was happening inside the German pilot's mind. They saw a Bf-109 that had come too close. They knew he could open fire at any moment. Perhaps someone inside the bomber was already preparing himself for the final burst. Perhaps someone thought the German pilot was merely choosing the best angle. Perhaps someone stared silently at the fighter and waited for flashes from its guns. In combat, one cannot immediately believe in mercy. It is too dangerous a luxury. Brown ordered his men to keep their weapons ready. The Americans pointed their guns toward the German aircraft, but they did not fire. That, too, was a decision. They could have opened fire with whatever weapons still worked. But perhaps they sensed that something strange was happening. The German was not attacking. He was flying beside them. Not behind, not above, not in position to finish them off, but beside them, as if escorting them. Between the two aircraft, an impossible pause appeared. The war continued around them, but for a few minutes inside this small scene, the rules of war stopped working. Stigler tried with gestures to tell Brown to land in Germany or turn toward neutral Sweden. From his point of view, it made sense. The damaged B-17 was barely holding together. The way to England was too dangerous, and neutral territory could give the crew a chance to survive. But the Americans did not understand his signals. To them, any turn in the direction indicated by a German fighter could mean captivity, death, or a trap. Brown wanted to go home. Not to Sweden, not to Germany. Home, across the sea, back to his own people, to an airfield where this crippled aircraft at least had a chance to land. Then Stigler took another step beyond the usual logic of war. He did not merely refuse to shoot. He flew beside the American bomber and escorted it toward the coast. This was not just mercy. It was risk. German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground might see the B-17, but beside it flew a German fighter. Firing at the American aircraft meant risking hitting one of their own. In this way, Stigler's presence effectively protected the damaged bomber from ground fire. Imagine the scene. Over Germany flies an American B-17, pierced, smoking, carrying wounded men. Beside it flies a German Bf-109. It does not attack. It does not finish the bomber off. It does not make a victory pass. It simply flies beside it, like a strange, silent guardian. Below is a country at war with the men inside that bomber. Above are two pilots who cannot speak, cannot explain their thoughts, cannot fully trust each other. And yet, for several minutes, something greater than fear exists between them. It was not friendship. Friendship would come later, decades afterward. In December 1943, it was only a silent recognition. One man saw that another man was on the edge of death, and he chose not to become the cause of that death. There is no naivety in this. Stigler did not stop being a German pilot. Brown did not stop being an American pilot. Their countries did not stop fighting. But in that specific second, one specific man refused to turn almost dead men into another victory. When the aircraft approached the sea, Stigler could go no farther. He had done what he could. He had not shot down the B-17. He had shielded it from anti-aircraft fire. He had tried to guide it toward a place where the crew might survive. Beyond that lay the route over the North Sea, and Brown would have to fly it alone. Before turning away, Stigler came closer, raised his hand in a farewell gesture, and flew back. In the cockpit of the American aircraft, that gesture must have seemed almost unreal. Only moments earlier, an enemy had been beside them, a man who could have destroyed them. Now he was leaving without firing a single shot. Perhaps the crew still did not fully understand what had happened. Perhaps they could not afford to think about it. They still had a damaged aircraft, wounded men, and the sea ahead. A miracle does not end the struggle. Sometimes it only gives you the chance to continue it. After Stigler left, Charlie Brown had to accomplish the second impossible thing of the day: bring the B-17 back to England. The machine was wounded. The controls were heavy. The engines were unreliable. Inside the aircraft, the men fought cold, pain, exhaustion, and fear. Outside was the sea, and if the aircraft fell into it, the chance of rescue would be almost nothing. But Brown held the course. He had already survived fire, falling, fighter attacks, and an encounter with a German aircraft that should have been the end. Now he had only to make it home. And he made it. Ye Olde Pub returned to England and landed. It was the landing of an aircraft that, by all logic, should have remained somewhere over Germany or in the icy water. When the damaged B-17 came down to Earth, its condition spoke for itself. This was not merely a bomber after a hard mission. It was a machine that had survived the nearly impossible. 9 members of the crew returned alive. 1 did not. And with them returned a story that was difficult for commanders to believe, and even harder to explain. Brown reported that a German pilot had not shot them down, but had escorted them toward the coast. But such stories are inconvenient during war. They interfere with the simple division of the world into friends and enemies. Commanders did not need bomber crews thinking about honorable German pilots. Tomorrow they would have to fly over Germany again. Tomorrow they would again be attacked by fighters. Tomorrow they would again have to shoot, bomb, and survive. War demands clarity, even when that clarity is rough and incomplete. So the story was not widely spread. It remained in the memories of those who had been there. For Franz Stigler, silence was even more important. If the German command had learned that he had deliberately spared a damaged American bomber, the consequences could have been severe. In a military system, such an act could easily be called betrayal, cowardice, or a violation of duty. Stigler risked not merely a decoration or a career. In Nazi Germany, he might have risked his freedom and his life. So he too kept silent. He returned to his base, but he did not tell the truth the way a man might tell it if he wanted praise. Some decisions must be carried inside because the world around them is not yet ready to call them right. Years passed. The war ended. Germany was ruined and divided. America brought its soldiers home. Many tried to forget. Many could not. Charlie Brown went on living, served, worked, grew older, but that day never disappeared from his memory. Some memories do not fade because they resemble nothing else. He may have forgotten the details of many flights, but he could not forget the German fighter that appeared beside him over Germany and did not fire. The question stayed with him for decades. Who was that pilot? Why had he done it? Had he survived the war? Did he remember that day? Or was it only one episode among hundreds for him? Brown did not know. He had only the image, a Bf 109 beside a shattered B-17, confusing gestures, an escort to the sea, and a farewell salute. It was a debt of memory to a man he had never seen on the ground. Decades later, Brown began searching for him. It was almost hopeless. Too much time had passed. The records were incomplete. The war had left behind millions of stories, and one brief meeting in the sky could easily vanish among them. But Brown searched. He turned to archives, veterans, publications, and anyone who might know. And one day, the search found an answer. The German pilot was alive. His name was Franz Stigler. He was no longer living in Germany, but in Canada. When they finally made contact, Stigler described details that only that very man could have known. The damaged aircraft, the escort, the attempt to guide it elsewhere, the farewell gesture. For Brown, it was confirmation. He had found the man who, on that day, could have become his killer, but instead became his savior. Their first meeting on the ground was the meeting of two old men whom war had once bound together. But at the center of that meeting were not hatred or victory. At the center stood a question stronger than all the rest. Why did you not shoot? Stigler's answer was neither political nor grand. He did not try to turn himself into a saint. He did not say the war was anything other than what it was. He had been a combat pilot. He had fought. He had seen death. But in the moment when he approached Ye Olde Pub, he saw not a combat target, but helpless men. He could not shoot them down any more than he would have shot a man hanging from a parachute. To him, it was no longer combat. It was killing. And he refused. From that moment, their story became not only a story of rescue, but a story of friendship. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler, two men who had met as enemies in the sky over Germany, became close friends. They wrote to each other, met each other, and told the story together. For both of them, that day was not merely an episode of war. It became proof that even in the most brutal system, a person can sometimes make a choice that does not fit the rules. That is why this story still grips people so strongly. It does not make war beautiful. On the contrary, it shows how terrible war is. If mercy had been ordinary, this case would not have become a legend. It is remembered precisely because it was an exception. Around it were orders, death, destruction, hatred, fear, propaganda, revenge, and duty. Within that world, one pilot looked at another and decided that, in that second, the human mattered more than the military. There is no simple division here between good and evil. Franz Stigler was not an imaginary hero without shadow. He was a Luftwaffe pilot, a participant in the war on Germany's side. Charlie Brown was not flying a peaceful mission either. His aircraft had taken part in a bombing mission, part of a vast and destructive campaign. That is exactly why the story should not sound like a fairy tale. It is stronger than a fairy tale because it takes place inside a real war, where every action carries weight and every act of rescue is surrounded by the shadows of those who did not survive. And that is what makes it honest. Sometimes a human act does not erase tragedy, but it still matters. Stigler did not stop the Second World War. He did not save a city. He did not cancel the bombings. He did not change the course of the front. He saved one aircraft and several men. For the great machinery of history, that may seem small. But for the men inside that aircraft, it was everything. For their families, it was everything. For Brown, it was everything. And decades later, for millions of people who heard the story, that act became a reminder. Even when the world turns people into targets, a person can still refuse to see only a target. There is a special power in the fact that the climax of this story was not a shot, but the absence of one. In war stories, people usually wait for the moment of attack. Guns open fire, an aircraft falls, the hero wins, the enemy is destroyed. Here, everything is reversed. The strongest moment is silence. A German pilot approaches a shattered American bomber, looks, judges, understands that he can destroy it with ease, and does not pull the trigger. Sometimes not doing something is harder than doing it. Especially when your role, your uniform, your army, and the war itself are telling you, do it. On December 20th, 1943, 2 aircraft flew side by side over Germany. One was heavy, damaged, and almost doomed. The other was fast, armed, and powerful. One wanted only to get home. The other could have ended its journey in seconds. But for several minutes, they were not hunter and prey. They were 2 machines carrying human beings. And that short flight became one of the most unusual episodes of the air war. When Charlie Brown later remembered Franz Stigler, he did not see merely a former enemy. He saw the man to whom he owed his life. When Stigler remembered Brown, he did not see merely an American pilot. He saw the man he had once spared because he could not finish off the helpless. Their friendship after the war became an almost impossible continuation of that scene in the sky. It was as if history gave them a second chance, no longer through gun sights and cockpit glass, but through conversation, memory, and gratitude. They both died in 2008. Franz Stigler died first. Charlie Brown died a few months later. There is something strange and almost literary in that ending. 2 men bound by one December day left the world in the same year. But the story remained. The image remained. A shattered B-17 that should have fallen, and a German fighter that could have shot it down, but instead escorted it to the sea. The question remained, stronger than any combat report. What makes a person human when war tries to take that right away? Perhaps that is why the story is still told. Not because it was the largest. Not because the fate of a front depended on it. Not because it changed the course of the war. It is told because it shows a rare moment when a crack opens inside war. And through that crack, one can see the sky of another world. A world where an enemy can still be a human being. Where honor can be stronger than an order. Where saving one crew can matter more than a personal victory. Where the loudest act is performed in complete silence. On December 20th, 1943, Franz Stigler could have shot down Charlie Brown. He had the opportunity. He had the weapons. He had a military reason. He had every external justification. But he did not fire. He chose mercy over destruction. He chose an act that could not be placed proudly in a report. He chose not the command of war, but the inner law of a human being. And if this story has one central meaning, it is not that war can be beautiful. War does not become beautiful because of one act of compassion. Its horror becomes even clearer. The meaning is different. Even where a person is surrounded by death, orders, fear, and hatred, there is sometimes still 1 second of choice. And in that second, he can decide who he will be. Franz Stigler decided that day not to be an executioner. Charlie Brown decided that day not to give up. One held the controls of an aircraft that should not have returned. The other held back the finger that should have pulled the trigger. Between those 2 decisions, a story was born. One that is still remembered as one of the most human stories of the Second World War. Because sometimes the strongest thing a soldier can do is not destroy the enemy. It is to see a human being in him